So one of the jobs of a statistician is to make statistical inferences about whole populations based on samples that are taken from that population. And confidence intervals are one way that we estimate a population parameter. Another way to make a statistical inference is to make a decision about a parameter. For instance, a car dealer advertises that its new small truck gets 35 miles per gallon on average. A tutoring service claims that its method of tutoring helps 90% of its students get an A or B, or a company says that women managers in their company earn an average of $60,000 per year. So a statistician will make a decision about these claims, and this process is called hypothesis testing. And a hypothesis test involves collecting data from a sample and then evaluating that data. Then you make a decision as to whether or not there is sufficient evidence, and you base that upon the data, analysis of the data, to reject the null hypothesis. So in this chapter, we will conduct hypothesis tests on single means and single proportions. Remember, the proportions are percentages. And then we'll also learn about the errors that are associated with these tests. So to perform a hypothesis test, a statistician needs to do the following. They need to set up two contradictory hypotheses. They need to collect sample data, determine the correct distribution to perform the hypothesis test. Then you analyze the sample data by performing the calculations that ultimately allow us to reject or decline to reject the null hypothesis, and then you make a decision and write a conclusion. So the actual test begins by considering two hypotheses. They're called the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. And these hypotheses are opposing viewpoints. So the null hypothesis, and it's H0, is a statement of no difference between sample means or proportions, or no difference between a sample mean or proportion and a population mean or proportion. So in other words, the difference is 0. Then there is the alternative hypothesis, which is H sub A. It's a claim about the population that is contradictory to the null hypothesis and what we conclude when we reject the null hypothesis. So since the null and the alternative hypotheses are contradictory, you must examine evidence to decide if you have enough information to reject the null hypothesis or not. The evidence is in the form of sample data. So after you've determined which hypothesis the sample supports, you make a decision. So there's two options for this decision. You either reject the null hypothesis if the sample information favors the alternative hypothesis, or you do not reject the null hypothesis if the sample information is insufficient to reject the null hypothesis. So take a look at the table here, and you'll notice that the null hypothesis, H0, we use equal, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. Then for the alternative hypothesis, we use not equal to, greater than, less than. In the next video, I'll go through several examples.